Doom is many things. It's scary, it's dark, and it's violent. Doom is also fast, groundbreaking, and demanding. Its gameplay defined the first-person shooter, and its technology defined the PC platform. No other series is perhaps so intertwined with the rise of PC gaming than Doom is. The core original trilogy defined a decade by pushing visuals and the platform to its limits. More than 30 years later now, in 2025, Doom: The Dark Ages has taken up the torch lit by the original game as it pushes the PC platform forward once again with its path-traced visuals. Now for today's video brought to you by Nvidia and Digital Foundry, I will be going back in time to highlight how the classic Doom games revolutionized visuals on PC and punished the PCs trying to render them, and how this legacy reflects on Doom: The Dark Ages in 2025. That's right, I am booting up period-correct hardware to show off how the games looked back in the day and just how much muscle it really took to run Doom the way it's meant to be played. So hit that power button, set that IRQ, and get psyched as I extol the technological virtues of Doom. When going back to look at Doom from 1993, it might be hard to appreciate what it achieved with a modern eye without the context of the contemporary gaming landscape. 3D gaming on home console and PC was still rudimentary and in its infancy in 1993. Player controls were often quite clunky and unresponsive in those games that had 3D graphics, and aspects of the 3D rendering were quite coarse. Polygons could either be unstable and wobbly when the camera moved, making the world seem like it would fall apart, or the graphics could be simply shaded and flat without texture or surface information. And world elements could draw in very obviously in the mid to short distance. Games were using 3D, but 3D worlds were held together loosely and lacked consistency and solidity, and if they were more complex, they tended to be slow. And I mean slow by 1993 standards. With modern standards for frame rate, we would probably classify some of these consumer home experiences with words like unplayable. 3D accelerators like the 3DFX Voodoo were still more than 2 years away, and there was no semblance of a standardized way to accelerate and render 3D graphics. As a result, it was unsurprising that these compromises were there and consumers lived with them. 3D PC games were still rendering on CPUs, and general-purpose x86 processors were not designed around that task, and they had double duty. They would render the game and process the gameplay code at the same time. When you place these type of earlier experiences side by side with Doom, I think you can more easily appreciate why Doom in 1993 could seem revolutionary in comparison to people who experienced it back then. Doom was comparatively fast, it controlled responsively and intuitively with great feedback, and it had an incredible level of detail and solidity in its game world. Its 3D surfaces were not constantly jittering or wobbling at their seams like you could find in other games. Doom also had many uncommon and complex visual features in its game world, which gave it its realistic look. It had detailed and varying textures on its walls, floors, and ceilings, of which the latter two were not common at the time in first-person games. It also had ceilings of variable height, so areas could look more complex than just corridor mazes seen in other games. And more importantly, the third dimension of height was not just a visual flourish. By using stairs or lifts, the player could go up to elevated platforms and look down on the levels below. Perhaps Doom's biggest visual differentiator, though, was its emulation of lighting. When you are in a more confined space in Doom, it's easy to notice that things further away get darker in the distance. The walls, the floors, and ceilings take on darker color values the further away they are from the player. This diminished lighting, as it is called, defined the game's moody look and was further enhanced by sector lighting. Here, artists could draw lines over the level geometry and define the brightness of that area and apply fades, flickers, and tie game logic to the brightness level. It leads to classic moments where the lights go out, change, or where you can see ultra-sharp and defined shadows from the level geometry. This isn't being simulated, mind you, but it's artist-drawn. The cumulative effect of all these visual flourishes on top of the high-resolution sprites was a game that was atmospheric, polished, and solid. And to make it look so good and run in real time, it required new techniques. For earlier first-person games like Wolfenstein 3D, they were typically done with ray casting, sending out a ray in screen space till it hit a 2D mapped coordinate and then drawing perspective correct strips of wall with a fixed height at the spot, potentially with mapped textures. Floors and ceilings were solid colors and an illusion, more or less. This was state of the art for first-person games. Getting more complex graphics with real ceilings and floors with varying heights and textures, while all having it run fast would be a challenge. Games like Ultima Underworld from 1 year prior to Doom did attempt it, but CPUs of that day limited its execution. Draw distance was capped very close to the camera, performance wasn't the best, the screen was small, and the surfaces wobbled unstably when the camera moved. With Doom, an entirely different approach was needed to get a similar look to this, but with better performance, stability, and draw distance. Instead of ray casting like in previous games by id, Doom uses binary space partition or BSP rendering where visibility, the things you can see, is dictated by a pre-calculated process. When a map is made, an offline calculation is done for any given point of the map. The map is split up into sectors and mapped out into a tree where visibility of adjacent and distant sectors is determined from the sector you're in. As the player runs through a level in first person, the sector they are in and their field of view determines which other sectors are drawn. Visibility is essentially computed beforehand so that a lot of the level is not rendered when it isn't seen. Walls are then rendered as strips, and the ceilings and floors are rendered as flats or visplanes, both with textures and sprites are then superimposed over this and perspective scaled based upon the sector they are in the BSP. This BSP rendering gave Doom its incredible speed, its ability to have lights, and its consistency where stuff just didn't jiggle or wobble around when the camera moved. But it had its limitations. Things do exist in 3 dimensions with height, but the way walls are rendered breaks if the camera is not looking parallel to the ground, causing a visual distortion if the camera was unlocked. Likewise, rooms could not be placed over other rooms and slopes weren't possible. The 3D was there, of course, and it was fast, but it had limitations due to the way rendering was being done. So how did it run though? Well, the top CPU at the time of Doom's release in December of 1993 was technically the original P5 Pentium, but due to an insanely high price and compatibility issues, it was not yet a viable mainstream computing platform. So instead, the real de facto highest-end hardware around Doom's launch was Intel's i486 DX2, and specifically the 66 MHz model, which was released in the last quarter of 1992. With a CPU like that, it is easy to see how, in spite of Doom's incredible optimization feats, that it was still a huge challenge for mainstream modern computing. Now, the model of DX266 I have is slightly below the highest end configuration that you could have around Doom's initial release date. Mine is using a fast VESA local bus video card, but it only has 128K of L2 cache instead of the highest end 256K. Looking at benchmarks from the time, my 486 DX2 scores slightly below the fastest write-through cache DX266s of that time period, so it scores a little bit lower in FPS than the top end, but it still represents the cream of the crop, a PC that would have easily cost well over $2,000 back in 1993, or around $4,500 in today's money. PC gaming was still incredibly expensive back in 1993. So how did an incredibly expensive PC play Doom? Well, looking at the full screen performance, it is faster than many other 3D games for sure, but performance is temperamental and very scene dependent. Doom runs at 70 Hz and ticks the game at half that frame rate, so it has a 35 FPS limit in modern parlance, and a 486 DX266 is only really hitting a nice 35 FPS in full screen graphics mode when in the most confined of spaces. Typical combat in moderately detailed views tends to be between 22 and 28 FPS, and the longest and most complex views found in episode 1 or 2 or 3 can even dip into the upper teens at worst. Doom was faster than the rest, but at full screen, even my competently benchmarking 486 DX266 is struggling by modern frame rate standards. But by the standards of 1993, where many 3D games ran quite a lot worse or had tiny little 3D viewports, this was a much more fluid and immersive experience than what many had seen before. And to get that level of immersion, you really could only be running a top-of-the-line PC from 1992 or 1993. If you had an older or lower-end 486, for example, one without cache or at 33 megahertz, you could easily be seeing half the frame rate or less than I'm showing here. And a CPU wasn't the only thing you needed. You needed to have a VESA local bus video card. The VLB standard was only introduced in 1992, 1 year before Doom's release, and an ISA video card does not mix well with Doom's fast drawing. Even with a good CPU, an ISA video card will run this game at a pitiful frame rate in full screen, even if the CPU could technically muster so much more. Essentially, unless you had a top-end and expensive PC for 1993 standards, Doom's full screen experience was going to be a slideshow. And even then, a DX266 is not exactly performing incredibly well by 2025 standards. So what recourse did a user have to play this game on a lower end kit or with faster frame rates? Well, you could elect to play the game not in full screen mode. Doom allows you to adjust the resolution of the gameplay by decreasing the viewport size, keeping the HUD map to the bottom, and the gameplay rendering resolution decreases as screen size goes down. In fact, Doom's starting viewport size is one down from a full unobstructed view, so per default, Doom actually has a border, presumably made default for performance reasons in 1993. Doom also has a low-quality graphics mode, which keeps the view size the same but doubles their rendered pixel width along the x-axis, making the game look chunkier. With options like these, the player could increase their fluidity of the game. The default window size over the full screen size, for example, increases performance by a useful 10%, which is quite meaningful when performance is as low as it is here. Sure, some of the gun and environment is cut off, but this was a sensible optimization, and it makes sense why id shipped the game rendering this way by default. The low detail setting is perhaps the best though for a performance win. Yes, the game is noticeably chunkier, but it performs more than 31% better than the full screen presentation and is quite often hitting that 35 FPS V-Synced line. It feels a lot smoother and looks a lot smoother, even though it is of course not perfect. And that was essentially the extent to which people could improve their performance in Doom within the release timeframe. Generally, people just put up with performance as it was, and were happy to see such a good-looking 3D world running as well as it did. For modern standards though, the best place to play Doom, the way it was meant to be played, was years later down the line with a Pentium-based PC, or one of the later highly clocked 486 models. Something like the lowest end 133 MHz Pentium on socket 7 from 2 years later runs Doom 1 at full speed essentially the entire time, with none of the hotspots dropping performance like we see on the DX2. And that Pentium level of performance would prove itself invaluable when Doom 2 released. Doom 2 is a sequel in the most classic way possible. It is the first game, but bigger. The technological underpinnings are essentially the same, but the levels and gameplay ambition are greater. Levels are much larger, and at times they have many more complex overlapping segments. Along with the maps being larger, especially in the middle part of the game, the enemies are found in greater abundance. With Doom 2 releasing in late 1994, the now 2-year-old 486 DX266 could run the smaller levels of Doom 2 well enough, but even while utilizing the smaller default window size, it's plain as day to see that the performance has depressed over the first game on the same hardware. And those larger levels found in the middle of the game, yeah, those run especially poorly, dipping at their worst into the low teens in some views, with all the enemies populating the streets below and the city skyline above. Even the heaviest areas of Doom 1 do not run this poorly. A more modern Pentium though, that runs these areas a lot better, keeping up to that 35 FPS line and being smooth. And thus, the best place to play Doom was on a future machine. The game pushed graphical technology so much on PC that it scaled really well after its release, running better the better your hardware got years later. It having ultra-demanding spec requirements for its fluid frame rates meant that PCs, even the high-end ones, in 1993 really couldn't play Doom to modern frame rate standards. Thankfully, the rapid advancement of processor technology made Doom run at full frame rate and full resolution just in a few years' time, and we have since then had gigantic leaps in processing power to the point now where Doom, a game which once made PCs tremble in fear, now runs on nearly everything. Not too long after Doom's release, we already started seeing Doom being brought over to portable machines, which was unthinkable just a few years earlier, like the Game Boy Advance, which managed to play both Doom 1 and Doom 2 surprisingly well, given how it is a turn of the Millennium device that runs on just 2 AA batteries. Years pass and powerful chips start finding their way into the places you least expect. 10 years ago, Doom is already running at full speed on ATM machines, with the pin numpad taking the place of the keyboard. Honestly, this one's pretty amazing. I would definitely play it. Doom not only runs anywhere, but it also displays anywhere. An oscilloscope with a built-in crosshair? Yeah, that works. Doom is so lightweight for modern computers that people have been rendering it in ever increasingly inefficient ways. Manually updating rows and columns of a Google spreadsheet to use it as a display device? It does run at a glacial 3 seconds per frame, but hey, it's unmistakably Doom. My personal favorite and least efficient way to display Doom has to be Doom running on Windows Task Manager. Here we see 896 CPU cores in a task manager setting where the artificially induced processor load causes the various cells to darken and lighten. Monochromatic low res and a stupidly expensive power bill, but this is Doom, gosh darn it. Doom and Doom 2's 90s tech is now charmingly quaint when we see it running like this, but the next Doom title that id would put out would be magnitudes heavier. After Doom 2, id would go on to iterate this technology in their Quake trilogy, adding full 3D look support with perspective correct height and room over room with light maps, and even hardware acceleration support for early 3D accelerators in Quake 1. Quake 2 would further enhance visuals with colored lighting and smooth animations, and Quake 3 upped the poly counts and performance with its support for hardware transforming lighting on the first GPUs, such as the GeForce 256. Quake was in while Doom was out. Yet after 3 Quake games, players were wondering when id would return to the series that made them a household name. When would we see the next Doom game? And what would it mean for the future of graphics technology?
We're about to ship macOS 10. And I'd like to show you something using the GeForce 3 and OpenGL running on Mac OS 10. And it's not a normal something. It's something by one of the legends in 3D computer graphics and gaming, John Carmack from id Software. And John today, welcome John.
As John Carmack stood on stage and showed off the technology that would drive Doom 3, he did it very specifically on the Nvidia GeForce 3, which was debuting here to release shortly after this very conference in Tokyo in 2001. The GeForce 3 was the first DirectX 8.0 compatible GPU. It had 64 megabytes of DDR video memory, and importantly, 4 pixel shaders and 1 vertex shader. Those aforementioned shading units would be the enablers of pioneering technologies to enable new types of shading in video games. Now, what did id show off here exactly on the GeForce 3? Here there's perhaps no better person to describe it than John Carmack himself.
Alright, what I've got here is a demonstration of our new in-development gaming engine, and this shows off some of the things that we can do with the power of the GeForce 3 in here. And all of this is actual real game code. There's no real special tricks going on here. Everything is being done real time. So the big trick that we're getting now is the final unification of lighting and shadowing across all surfaces in a game. Because games have had to do these hacks and tricks for years now where we do different things for characters and different things for environments and different things for lights that move versus lights that are static. And now we're able to do all of that the same way for everything. We're able to go ahead and apply all of these on every single pixel rather than every vertex or even every object like we used to do.
As John says, Doom 3's tech would unify lighting and shadowing, and importantly, do it all in real time, which was an absolute rarity at this debut point in 2001. See, in older id Tech games, or like in many other game engines of the time, dynamic moving objects like characters or weapon pickups were lit entirely different than the environment, giving them this look like they're floating or superimposed over the environment, which is statically lit. id Tech 4 or Doom 3 would scrap all of that and light each object in real time in a per pixel way thanks to bump mapping. As we can see on these character models here in Doom 3, bump mapping made it so each pixel on the character texture is uniquely shaded, which dramatically enhances lighting detail and realism. Bump maps also add on the dimension of specular lighting, so we can see the sharp or dull highlights of local lights showing up on object surfaces. This specular dimension to lighting makes it so Doom 3 can more accurately portray metallic or shiny objects. With bump mapping and per pixel lighting on every object in Doom 3 essentially, it looked generationally different than what had come before. And the bow tie on this new shading model, powered by the first tech developed for the GeForce 3, were stencil shadow volumes. Doom 3 has incredible real-time shadowing from arbitrary light sources. Objects can move and the shadows parallax correctly with them, and lights can also move themselves, causing a cascading dance of all the shadows in the environment. And as mentioned, the way Doom 3 did this was with a technique called stencil shadow volumes. Generally with this technique, a camera from the perspective of a light is rendered and rays are traced to the vertices of the geometric objects in the scene. The technique's name comes into play with the 2D stencil buffer generated from this, which looks like it's traced lines on the geometry's edge. The negative space in the 3D scene beyond this vertex silhouette is extruded into a volume mesh that covers the scene from the primary view. With this, any bit of geometry that lies within the volume behind the occluding object are not lit by the light source in question, and the shadow is additively blended onto the scene. The end image is one with extremely precise, down to the pixel shadows, and they are only limited in their accuracy by the amount of geometry on the silhouette of the casting object. This technique can render shadows to a level of accuracy that we are only now returning to again with ray tracing in the modern era. With these new shading and shadowing techniques, Doom pushed a world fully lit and shadowed in real time where objects were all treated equally in rendering, lending the visuals a solidity and flawlessness and unity that is unparalleled at this time. And the gameplay of the game leaned into it, with you having a flashlight to light everything up and find things in the environment. Yes, there are some issues with the tech, like how there is no bounce lighting in the game, so everything is pitch black in the shadow, and of course the shadows cannot represent soft shadows, but still, playing the game more than 2 decades later in its original incarnation, I am floored by its graphical quality in spite of the vintage. The question is, was Doom 3 as hardware hungry as its predecessors? Did you need a PC from the future to run it at full frame rate? Here we can answer the question well by just going back to that GeForce 3. Released in 2001, a little more than 3 years before Doom 3's eventual release, the game's technology did debut on that GPU and was demonstrated on it by John Carmack on stage. Surely it should be able to run the game fine, right? Well, loading up the game at the high settings at 800 by 600 might shock you somewhat. At these settings, using the game's specific GeForce 3 rendering path, the game's frame rate dances anywhere between 10 and 60 FPS depending upon what is going on. The most important visuals are there, the stencil shadows and per pixel shading with specularity, but it is running oh so poorly. This was the highest end GPU just released 3 years earlier, and it is frankly unplayable at a modest resolution without any anti-aliasing. To put it into context, 800 by 600 is like the 1080p of today, and nothing fancy. It's exactly 1/4 the resolution of the highest common resolution of that time, which was 1600 by 1200, much like how 1080p stands next to 4K today. And some further context to this performance here. The GeForce 3 can play the previous id Tech game, Quake 3, with 2 times MSAA hitting 60 FPS at 1024 by 768, which is kind of like the 1440p of our time period. This GPU, which launched at $499 USD or $900 USD in today's money, was not playing this game well. How could this happen if they showed the game running off on this GPU in the first place? Well, that original demo was small, non-complex environments, and the game has a lot more geometry and many more lights. And more lights affecting each pixel for each piece of geometry means more shading passes. This is why the game has such a roller coaster-like performance on the GeForce 3. It can do pixel shading, but in a limited capacity, and the areas that require more pixel shading and have more geometry will tank the frame rate due to the inherent complexity of it. So what recourse did a person have back then to run this game on older kit like this to increase performance? Well, you could drop resolution to 640 by 480, which was basically the 720p of the time period. Doing that doubled performance when it's at its worst, but this doesn't really change the roller coaster nature of the performance, since it is pixel shading limited. The game is still often below 30 FPS even at 640 by 480. Truly, on a GPU like this, the most stable frame rate was achieved by turning off all the effects which made Doom 3. With no bump mapping, specularity, or shadow volumes at the lowest settings at 480p, the frame rate can be consistently above 30 FPS. But it doesn't exactly look good. So what type of GPU did it require to get Doom 3 running the way it was meant to be played? Benchmarking the generations of GPUs at the game's high settings at 800 by 600 shows that only when you get up to 6 series of GPUs does the game hit an incredibly consistent 60 FPS at this resolution. The 4 series is hammered almost as much as the 3 series, in spite of running more than 50% faster at times. And the 5 or FX series is doing well enough, but it still can often dip below 60 FPS in the more complex views of this cutscene here, which is representative of some of the heavier areas in the game. So as I see it, you would need the highest end 5 series GPU like I'm showing here, or a mid to upper range 6 series GPU to get Doom running well by modern standards, that is 60 FPS. In the case of a 6800 GT I have here clocked up to 6800 Ultra levels, it can actually play the game with near flawless 60 FPS at 1024 by 768 with 2x MSAA, which is kind of like a modern heavy game at 1440p in comparison with all the bells and whistles turned up. Even with one of the highest end GPUs like this one at Doom's release, you still technically were not getting the game's highest graphical quality without compromises, as GPUs at release only had a maximum of 256 megabytes of VRAM, and to fit in that amount and lower, Doom 3 shipped with varying levels of texture compression depending upon the GPU's available memory. That's why the comparison I showed off between the GPU generations earlier showcased such variable texture quality. The GeForce 3 with its 64 megabytes of VRAM has worse quality textures than the 128 megabyte GeForce 4 Ti 4800, and that has worse texture quality than the 256 megabyte 6800 GT. The 6800 GT here is not even using the game's highest texture quality, even though it has the highest end VRAM configuration by release date. Uncompressed textures that were actually the ultra quality textures in Doom 3 required at least 512 megabytes of VRAM, and no GPU had that. So only GPUs of the future, like we're seeing here on the right, could play Doom 3 with uncompromised fidelity. In Nvidia's case for its reference cards, only the 7900 GTX from nearly 2 years later in 2006 could actually play Doom 3 with these uncompressed textures. So Doom 3 was heavy and forward-looking, and it crushed the GPU it was originally showed off on in 2001. Still, it has more graceful scaling to lower-end components than Doom 1 did in 1993. Yes, there were big compromises necessary with resolution, but you could technically load up the game on lower-end GPUs to get playable performance. Doom 1 by comparison was a slideshow on anything but the most recent ultra-expensive PC in 93, and even then it's not great by modern standards there. Conversely, in 2004, Doom 3 actually ran wonderfully at launch on the GeForce 6 series, as performance shows, while using the headlining features there at high resolutions even with anti-aliasing. Thankfully for the low end, time passes and now Doom 3 is a lot easier to run, where it even runs on something like the original Switch, which only consumes less than 10 watts in its handheld mode. There it targets 60 FPS at 720p. Sure, it drops from that target, but it just goes to show how something which caused giant PC towers to sweat now runs on battery-powered devices. Now, as time moved on after Doom 3, game development saw incredible changes where id shifted away from being a PC-only studio to being a multi-platform developer, shipping games that would run even on the lowest-end consoles of the time. This inevitably meant a shift away from the ultra-high-end mindset that was there in the original Doom trilogy. Doom: The Dark Ages in 2025 sees a return to this PC-focused ethos, where the PC version is rigorously demanding when maxed out and looks incredible for it. But this time around, due to advances in graphical techniques and optimizations, Doom is future-proofed at the same time as running well on lower and older parts. Doom The Dark Ages does target the ultra high end with path tracing, but unlike Doom 3 and especially unlike 1993 Doom, playing Doom The Dark Ages on a lower end GPU doesn't mean a massively compromised experience. An RTX 2060, one of the lowest end RTX desktop GPUs released based on nearly 7-year-old architecture, still manages to play the game at above 60 FPS primarily at the lowest settings with good image quality. This GPU is in fact below the game's official minimum specifications, yet here it is running the game at 60 FPS on its heaviest level, The Siege Part 1. A big reason for this game having much more lax minimum requirements for good visual experiences is due to the invention of DLSS, or Deep Learned Super Sampling. Back in the old days, like with Doom 1, you had to ultra compromise on resolution fidelity to increase frame rates. Now with DLSS 4, Transformer model in 2025, a high-end game like this can still manage to run at 1080p even on this lower old-end GPU because of DLSS. Without DLSS, a GPU like the RTX 2060 base version here would have to run the game at 720p with the game's TAA to get a similar level of performance, like we can see on the left here. Without DLSS on the left, the visual quality yielded for that compromised resolution is intense. The game is blurry, ghosty, and pixelated. At that same level of performance on the right, in DLSS performance mode, the game is so much sharper, more detailed, and with more complete anti-aliasing and far less flicker. This is only possible due to advancements in silicon, like with the Tensor Core, and advancements in software which can utilize that new hardware. It's a new form of hardware acceleration, and as a result of it, even older GPUs like this one can scale farther into the future and have a good visual experience years down the line. In the 90s or early 2000s, such a thing just wasn't possible, and if your PC was a few years old, it was horribly out of date and probably couldn't play new games. At the same time as scaling lower, Doom The Dark Ages scales higher than Doom 1 or Doom 3 ever did due to its path tracing. Path tracing here can greatly enhance the game's visuals, adding in entire new layers to the game's lighting. Like here, we can see at this cave entrance where the pared back standard ray tracing fails to capture that local light bounce that the path tracing captures with incredible detail. Or here on this floor where the game's standard rendering cannot manage to represent this surface with its complex, rougher reflections that path tracing effortlessly handles. The best part about path tracing really is that it essentially scales infinitely into the future the more resolution and frame rate you throw at it. It'll have higher detail, better quality, and greater lighting conversions as frame rate and resolution increases. So in 10 years when we load this game up again on ultra beefy GPUs of the future, we'll have an even better experience than we have now. Still, in spite of that fact, path tracing is heavy in the here and now, but we're lucky that software and hardware can provide a better experience at release than would have been possible in the past with such heavy tech. If we had less flexible hardware like we had in the past, Doom The Dark Ages with path tracing would be stuck at sub 4K low resolutions even on an RTX 5090 to hit above 60 FPS all the time. But an RTX GPU nowadays is capable of so much more to enhance the experience. With DLSS 4 Transformer with ray reconstruction, we can pump up the visual quality immensely up to 4K, still while running at lower internal resolutions. And then frame generation on top of that allows the GPU to generate multiple machine-learned frames in between classically rendered ones, vastly amplifying smoothness. With DLSS in 2025, the power is there to play Doom The Dark Ages with path tracing at 4K, with visual fluidity that just wasn't there under previous technological paradigms of the past. This type of fluidity and fidelity would usually require multiple GPU generations to have occurred before you would get to it. I really find it incredible that the tech has advanced to this point. So coming to the end of this video here covering Doom of the past and present, I think we've learned some interesting things. Each iteration of Doom has pushed visual rendering forward in different ways. Doom 1 with its fast 3D, Doom 2 with its scale, Doom 3 with its real-time lighting and shading powered by new GPU architectures, and Doom The Dark Ages now with its path tracing, once again powered by new GPU architectures. Alongside those foundational new technologies, each game after Doom 2 scaled more gracefully to the lower end of the hardware spectrum. Doom 1 maxed barely ran on anything. Doom 3 required the most recent powerful GPUs for fluid frame rates at reasonable resolutions. And Doom the Dark Ages in 2025 somehow manages to run well on a 6-year-old GPU. I think that is a triumph of optimization on id's side, and it goes to show how much cumulative hard work has gone into software development and hardware design to make such a thing even possible. Anyway, if you did like this video covering the tech of Doom, then hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, hit that little bell in the corner to get instant notifications, support us on Patreon, follow on social media, and as always, this is Alex, bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen!